When 1,000 locks fall, not in rage but in reason, do they silence a people or finally let them speak? In the sweltering heat of Ouagadougou, capital of Burkina Faso, metal met flame. But this was no war. This was no riot. It was fire wielded with discipline, welding torches hissing as they sealed steel gates shut. Under the direct orders of President Ibrahim Traore, row after row of motorcycle dealerships were closed methodically, deliberately, as if correcting something that had gone unchecked for too long. By midday, the streets were no longer choked by price gouging. They breathed slowly, cautiously, as if remembering what fairness feels like. This was no token gesture. It was not 7 shops. It was not 20. It was dozens, some say over 100, closed in one sweeping act. And the doors did not crash down. They were shut with the calm force of justice arriving late, but unshakable. Crowds formed. No clapping, no crying, just silence, the kind that follows clarity. Burkina Faso had made its choice not against commerce, but against corruption. If you have ever watched your people robbed of motion, of freedom, of basic dignity, comment amen. Because sometimes the loudest justice is the one that shuts a door so a nation can finally open its eyes. You do not need walls to be imprisoned. Sometimes all it takes is a price tag with no mercy. On the wind-blown edges of Bobo Dioulasso, Miriam rises before the stars give way to light. She walks 6 miles to her small stall and 6 miles home beneath a tired moon. Not because she chooses to, but because the motorbike she once imagined herself riding has been priced out of reach again and again. She stops outside dealerships, runs her hand over dusty handlebars, recites numbers like prayers, and walks away, again. Her story is not rare. It is repeated in every province. Young men with dreams carry buckets instead of blueprints. Mothers carry children and burdens in equal weight. Nurses, builders, teachers, everyone moves slowly, not from choice, but from an economic design never meant for them to move at all. The motorbike was never just transport. It was hope on 2 wheels. It was a silent vow that you could reach further than your job, your block, your circumstance. It was how possibility found a way. And yet for years that promise vanished, not with war, not with famine, but with numbers. Cold, calculated, profit-choked numbers. Dealers blamed transport fees. Importers pointed to global demand. Logistics analysts wrote of supply shocks. And beneath all that sterile language, families grew still. Not just in motion, but in spirit. There is a difference between not moving and no longer believing you were ever meant to. Ask the taxi man in Ouagadougou who pushes his motorcycle uphill because he cannot afford gas. Ask the mother in Banfora who counts coins for days then gives up. Ask the child in Kaya whose father returns from work too tired to speak because the fare to town devours the day's wage. They will all tell you the same thing: the prices were not rising with fairness. They were rising with disregard. They called it free market. But what is freedom if it only flows in one direction, upwards? Because this was not just about machines. It was about a system that quietly bled time, motion, and breath from the poorest. This was not normal inflation. It was a quiet suffocation. And everyone felt it. They just did not know where the hands were. The suppliers overseas, the distributors unnamed, the reports opaque, but the pain local, immediate, daily. You saw it in the young man selling water, not for lack of ambition, but for lack of range. In the grandmother skipping appointments because the trip cost more than the treatment. In the wide eyes of children watching wheels spin past, never knowing they too were born to ride. And what of the leaders in faraway capitals who toast to growth while watching their citizens crawl? What of the endless conferences that cheer statistics but say nothing when rice, rent, and rubber all rise faster than hope? Burkina Faso was not the only country where 2 wheels became a luxury, but it was the first to say no more. When President Ibrahim Traore ordered the lockdown, he did not simply target merchants. He cracked the mirror of an entire system. A system that convinced the poor their poverty was personal failure. A system that made mobility an imported dream. A system that taught people to lower their gaze, shrink their ambitions, and thank the silence for sparing them worse. But maybe the real chains were never metal. Maybe they were myths. Maybe the cruelest prison was the idea that Africans must always wait. Wait for aid, for permission, for better days. And maybe that's why this act mattered, because it was not about doors being locked. It was about eyes being open. Silence in Africa has never been neutral. It always favors the ones holding the pen, not the ones holding their breath. But now across the alleys of Ouagadougou, people are whispering new words, ancient but awakening. Dignity, direction, deservedness. And yes, they are whispering another name too, once invisible in ledgers, now etched in the heart of every change, Ibrahim Traore. If you have ever watched your country shrink under the weight of greed wearing a suit, if you have ever wondered why the poorest must pay the most for the smallest freedoms, comment Amen, not in rage, but in realization. Because before a revolution shouts it whispers. And in Burkina Faso, that whisper has become a win. Power does not always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears dust, and sometimes it says nothing because the numbers scream loud enough. Inside the presidential compound, the meeting room was built to impress outsiders. Gleaming tile floors, imported chandeliers, ceilings high enough to echo. But that morning there were no cameras, no handshakes, no elegant scripts. Only Ibrahim Traore sitting in a plain wooden chair surrounded by silence and numbers that felt like fire on paper. A young inspector from the Economic Fraud Division stood before him, the fatigue in his eyes barely masking the fire of conscience. His hands held documents, though documents was generous. What he held was evidence of theft dressed as commerce. Motorbike shops selling at 2-3 times the true value. No receipts, no listed suppliers, just blanks, excuses, and shadows. Traoré said nothing for a long while. He stared at the empty fields on the page, not as bureaucratic failures, but as wounds left untreated for too long, wounds with names, with faces, with consequences. One minister shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. President," he ventured, "this is sensitive. These shops provide jobs. These dealers have reach. If we act too hard too fast, we risk losing them." Another added. "No," Traoré said softly. "We risk losing ourselves." Then came a voice from across the table, a foreign-trained economic advisor. "We must weigh the signal this sends to investors. The regional bloc may withdraw," its Traoré turned to him measured. "What bloc defends a system that profits from strangling its own people?" The room froze. He rose slowly. His fatigues were frayed. Dust from the villages still clung to his boots. He had not changed since returning from the places where the real country lived, where farmers walk miles for bread, where 5 families share one bicycle, where a barefoot child had chased his convoy yelling, "Président, je peux avoir une moto." No one in the convoy had answered the boy, but Traoré had brought the boy's voice with him. "I've heard your concerns," he said. "I understand the weight of what we're about to do." He swept the room with his gaze, not with fury, but with moral clarity. "But I was not elected to shelter fear. I was chosen to break it." A silence, thick and full, fell across the table. "Lock the doors," he said. "Every shop that cannot prove fair pricing. Begin in Ouagadougou, then move outward." A stir of murmurs broke the air. "But the IMF," someone warned. "They do not price our dignity," Traoré replied. "They can impact credit," another offered. "But they cannot dictate our conscience." And with that, the decision was sealed. That afternoon, the city changed rhythm. Footsteps echoed not of an army, but of resolve. Not repression, but restoration. Inspectors moved through neighborhoods. They carried clipboards, not rifles. Asked questions not for loyalty, but for proof. Proof few could offer. No invoices, no trail. Just practiced lies and vanished accountability. And so one by one, the metal doors came down. Calmly, deliberately, street by street, corner by corner. From balconies, cafes, market stalls, the people watched. Some clapped, some cried, some turned away ashamed they once believed this was just how the system works. But everyone understood. This wasn't vengeance. It wasn't war against business. It wasn't punishment for ambition. It was a reclamation of meaning, a reminder that success built on exploitation is failure by another name, and that governments are not caretakers of pain. They are architects of protection. So yes, justice arrived wearing boots, but not the polished kind. They were scratched, dirty, worn from walking the same long roads as the people they now served. And when those boots stepped into the domain of greed and whispered theft, they did not tiptoe. They landed with intent. With finality, they stomped. If you have ever wished your leaders would defend your dignity with more than words, write the word fight in the comments. Because justice is not a slogan, it is a decision. And in that moment, under the weighted sky of Burkina Faso, justice stood up, put its boots on, and walked uninvited into power. There were no sirens, no slogans, no smoke in the air. Yet by midweek in Ouagadougou, a different kind of storm had rolled in silent, steady and undeniable. It was not chaos that swept through the streets. It was clarity. Block by block, a quiet procession began. Inspectors in faded uniforms, boots kissed with red earth, walked with a different kind of power. Not the power of fear, the power of decision, the weight of a government that had finally stopped asking permission to protect its people. One after another, motorcycle shops were approached. Some still had customers browsing. Others had already pulled their shutters halfway as if trying to stall the inevitable. But when the knock came, it did not ask for deals. It asked for truth. Do you have proof of your pricing? Can you show your supply records? Is there any link between the cost and the markup? Most had no answers. Some reached for faded ledgers. Others pointed vaguely at prices scribbled in ink that had long bled into the pages. But many had nothing, no receipts, no traceable suppliers, only the armor of habit and phrases worn thin. This is just how it's done. This is the market. But the market that day met something it could not deflect: the collective will of the people. And the people watched. Women leaned from windowsills, children barefoot on the curbside, elders steady on canes who had seen promises come and go. They did not clap. They did not weep. They bore witness. And in witnessing, something long buried began to stir. A mother near the central square bent toward her daughter and whispered, "Do you see, Aisha? For once the lock is not for their safety. It is for ours." The girl said nothing, but her eyes never left the final weld. A foreign reporter stood nearby, notebook in hand, confusion in his voice. "Is this not economic repression?" he asked. An old man, arms crossed, replied gently in French, "If feeding your people is political, then yes, we vote for it." The silence was not an absence of sound. It was the presence of meaning. It was memory made visible. People remembered. The motorbike that one week cost a cow and the next a harvest. The arbitrary price hikes that arrived without logic, explanation, or apology. And now finally someone dared to ask why. No doors were kicked in, but those who had built fortunes on invisibility began to tremble. Not the public, the profiteers. For too long they had bet on silence, that no one would look, that no one would knock, that no one would ask. They were wrong. Justice did not roar that day. It whispered, it knocked. And when no answer came, it locked with purpose, not vengeance. Still, not everyone approved. There were urgent calls to embassies, careful memos sent to donors, polished press releases from foreign ministries. We urge openness. We value transparency. We monitor the situation. But this time, transparency belonged to the people. They stood in sunlight, unhidden, unafraid. And when asked what they thought, they did not quote policies. They told stories. "My uncle died walking to the clinic," said a woman in a blue head wrap. "The bike was broken. The replacement too expensive. They told us to wait for the economy. Now the economy can wait for us." In a corner cafe, a young man tapped into his phone. "It feels like we belong to a country again. Because justice, when it is near, feels not like conquest. It feels like return. To those who thought this was just about business, just bikes, just numbers, you missed the soul of it. This was about boundaries, not lines on maps, but the lines of dignity. And those lines had been crossed for too long. If shutting down greed is tyranny, what name do we give to the decades of sanctioned theft? If you have ever watched pain be sold at a profit and watched silence be packaged as policy, share this story. Let the silence speak. Because that day in Ouagadougou, the shops did not fall. They surrendered, not to power, but to truth. And truth, when it rises, does not ask for permission. It only asks for eyes that are ready to see, for courage that no longer wears a mask. Justice does not stop at borders, and neither does the will to be free. It began like wind slipping under a closed door, a whisper from Togo, then a murmur from Mali, then echoes from Senegal, Benin, Côte d'Ivoire. Not chants, not protests, just a single question spoken in different tongues but meaning the same thing. Can someone do this in my country too? In Lomé, a mother shared the video of the shuttered shops and whispered to her son, "This is not fiction, my child. This is what a government looks like when it remembers who it serves." In Dakar, a fisherman, sun-worn and silent, turned to his brother and said, "We send justice abroad like a product, but for ourselves we import only injustice." In Abidjan, a teacher of 2 decades wrote to his former student, tears staining the keyboard, "I've spent years grading essays about governance. But today, for the first time, I see one lived." The images from Burkina Faso, the locks, the crowds, the dust rising behind boots that walked with purpose, spread across the continent faster than policy ever could. No captions, no commentary. Because truth, when visible, doesn't need subtitles. In Ghana, the talk turned to second-hand bikes shipped from overseas, taxed and twisted until their final price mocked the average wage. In Nigeria, students asked each other, "If there are motorcycles on every road, why are our futures still crawling?" And in Cameroon, a nurse whispered to her friend, "If one nation can stop the bleeding, why can't we?" But not all whispers carried hope. Inside government chambers across West Africa, the phrase Burkina model appeared in memos, with fear not praise. Reports warned of unorthodox methods, populist dangers, and regional instability. Translation: it's working, and that terrifies us. They were not afraid of shuttered stores. They were afraid of awakened citizens. Because what if people started asking for receipts? For proof, for justice, measured in documentation, not promises? What if the public stopped waiting for answers from Geneva and started building them in Ouagadougou? What if they stopped asking their leaders to perform and started demanding they show up, dusty boots and all? That is why embassies went quiet. Why foreign analysts drafted reports full of vague concern. Why editorial pages called for balance? Because Burkina Faso did not call in a billion-dollar loan. It did not summon an army of consultants. It did not wait for a think tank's permission slip. It simply acted. And that action, quiet, clear, grounded in real people, was more infectious than 1,000 summit speeches. Because if justice in one place threatens the comfort of another, then what does that say about the comfort across message boards, call-in radio shows, smoky tea stalls, and cracked phone screens? One question repeated like a drumbeat. What would happen if we asked those same questions in our city? In our market, a farmer in Niger wrote, "I want a president who walks like Traoré. Not just talks, walks." A man in Monrovia said, "We're done waiting. Waiting for loans, waiting for reforms, waiting for hope that never lands. We wait no more." And under a photo of sealed shop fronts, a teenage girl in Freetown typed, "This is what freedom feels like. Not granted, claimed. So let the whisper move. Let it dance through WhatsApp groups, past border patrols, into classrooms and market stalls, into the spaces where truth has waited too long to be said aloud." Write the name of your country in the comments if you're ready. Ready for a new chapter. Ready for courage that doesn't just speak but builds. Because punishment is not the end. Justice doesn't finish with closure. It begins again in what we dare to build next. The shops had closed, but the people hadn't. And that right there was the revolution. In the weeks after the sweep, something rare stirred in Burkina Faso. Not inside glass towers or polished halls, but in places long ignored, warehouses, blanketed in dust, empty lots that policy had forgotten. On the outskirts of Ouagadougou, inside a repurposed airplane hangar, sound returned. Not the clash of protest signs, not the confused murmur of debates, but a rhythm older than politics, hammers striking steel welders, glowing blue sewing machines, humming paint spraying onto metal. The sound of building. President Ibrahim Traoré's government had not just ended exploitation. It had planted the first seeds of creation. No press conferences, no ribbon cutting, just tools, sweat, and purpose. A new program was launched, not in Geneva, not in Brussels, right here. Moto pour, tous motorbike for all. But this wasn't about handouts. This was about hands, engineers, students, blacksmiths, tailors, mechanics. The very people once told they were unskilled or obsolete were now called not as workers, but as creators. "We're not here to copy their machines," said one young builder, oil streaked across his cheek. "We're here to make our own future move." The bikes they built weren't fancy. They were honest. strong frames, efficient engines, seats stitched by local women's cooperatives, tires molded from recycled rubber, and on every fuel tank painted in black over bold red the words Né du Sol, pour le peuple, born from the soil, for the people. It wasn't charity, it was sovereignty. Prices didn't drop because they were forced to. They dropped because a new logic had arrived, one born in sweat, not speculation. Now a teacher could ride a bike built near his school. A rural nurse no longer had to beg for a lift. A delivery man didn't rely on parts that crossed oceans and corruption before reaching his hands. This was never just about wheels. It was about worth. And the people felt it. From outside, the backlash came as expected. Foreign suppliers screamed contract violations. Multinationals pulled out. PR campaigns smeared the bikes as unregulated, risky, unfit for global markets. When asked about this, President Traoré didn't flinch. They can take back their parts, he said. We will forge our own path. This wasn't isolation. It was independence with the engine still warm and the blueprints made in local hands. And something deeper shifted. People began looking at other things, bandages, bricks, books, and asking if we can build this. What else were we told we couldn't? The factory became more than a workplace. It became a classroom, a cathedral, a place where the hum of machinery became prayer. In mosques and churches, people no longer prayed only for rain. They prayed for courage, the courage to keep building, to never again outsource their worth. Because freedom doesn't always roar like thunder. Sometimes it purrs like a motorbike your neighbor built from scratch. And that hum, the sound of dignity repaired, grew louder with each sunrise. They weren't just building transport, they were building testimony. Proof that what was stolen, hope, pride, momentum, could be returned. Not by donation, not by permission, but by hands. Yours, mine, ours. If you still believe Africa can rise not by survival, but by creation, tag someone who still believes too. Let them hear this. Let them feel this. Because what happened in Burkina Faso wasn't imported. It was remembered. And no matter how fast the wheels turn, the greatest movement begins inside the mind. They said he shut down commerce, that he strangled the economy, that he waged war on free trade. But when President Ibrahim Traore finally stood before a quiet crowd in Ouagadougou, his voice did not thunder. It simply reached. I did not lock their doors, he said. I unlocked the soul of my people, and the people understood. In that courtyard, an old man held a crumpled receipt like it was scripture. His hands shook not from fear but from awe. For the first time in his life, that piece of paper meant something. Not just a record of purchase, a record of possibility. He had bought a motorbike, not for himself, for his granddaughter to carry her to school without walking 8 kilometers through heat and rain. So she wouldn't arrive already defeated. So she wouldn't miss lessons when the clouds broke. So she would grow up believing that even a poor man can change the future. He wept, not because he was broken, but because for the first time no one told him he couldn't. And in that tear, buried beneath the dust and silence, was a truth long denied. Poverty is not weakness. It is not fate. It is not shame. It is a consequence engineered in conference rooms, rubber stamped by people who never waited in line, who never watched a harvest die, who never walked 12 kilometers for medicine. Now the people were unlearning the lie, because Burkina Faso had not only changed its policy, it had rewritten its reflection. But change never arrives without resistance. As the Motoportus program grew, orders surged, families saved, co-ops placed bulk requests, schools offered discounted transport, and for a moment it felt like momentum had found wheels. Then the banks arrived, not to help, to halt. Loan requests were declined, not loudly but strategically. Unverified assets, supply chain concerns, terms that masked an old fear. What happens when the poor no longer need permission? What happens when people realize they can move without importers, without financiers, without dependency? The government answered not with speeches, but with structure. The National Solidarity Fund was born, not funded by squeezing the poor, but by reclaiming what luxury had wasted. A pool of dignity, not charity, created for those who were never invited to speak. And it began again, quietly. Loans small but life-altering. Enough for a teacher to ride, enough for a farmer's wife to start deliveries, enough for dignity to take root where silence once ruled. The people gave it a name, le Fond de ceux qu'on n'avait jamais écouté, the fund of those who were never heard. Outside a small cooperative, a woman placed her hand gently on the handlebars of her new motorbike. She didn't ride. She stood, still, breathing, belonging. When asked why, she said softly, "Because for once I am not standing still." And that right there is the meaning of liberation. Not flags waving, not statues falling, but a receipt held like a seed, a machine built by neighbors, a hand trembling not from taking, but from giving. If your freedom must be signed off by foreign lenders, ask yourself, is it truly yours? That is the question now, not for Burkina Faso, but for the world watching. Because this story is not about one man, not about one nation, not about one moment. It is about what becomes possible when people remember they were never broken, only taught to think they were. It is about a new kind of justice designed, not demanded, lived, not lobbied for, built, not borrowed. And it is about the realization that the locks we feared most were never on the doors. They were on our spirit. And now we hold the key. If you felt seen in this story, if you felt the spark of truth or the ache of possibility, comment rise. Not just for Burkina Faso, but for your street, your city, your people. Because the revolution is not coming. It is being built bit by bit, wheel by wheel, hand by hand. And it does not need permission. It only needs you.